Hello everybody and welcome back. Today I have a really fun video that I would like to share with you that I've been thinking about doing for quite a long time. And it centers around the idea of literary writing groups or groups of literary figures who got together to discuss and talk about reading. So anyone who is a science fiction fantasy fan has probably heard of the Inklings, which was a group of writers, professors that gathered together on a regular basis to discuss and critique each other's work. And of course, famously, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were a part of that group. But there have been other groups outside of that science fiction and fantasy sphere that have met as well. So there was the Bloomsbury group, there was the group of Americans who were living in Paris during the time of Hemingway who met together and critiqued each other's work famously in various cafes in the city of Paris. And then we have a literary group that sparked kind of a phrase in the national jargon in North America, and that was the Algonquin Round Table. So the Algonquin Round Table was actually a group of writers, playwrights, literary critics who met up in, throughout time in the 1900s, and not only did they critique each other's work, but I think it became also a bit of a societal note of prestige. I think that they just got together to kind of share their wit and their humor. And this idea of an Algonquin Round Table is something that has kind of been passed along through the pop culture. And something that I have thought about frequently is if I were to have my own kind of literary Algonquin Round Table where I could invite 10 of my favorite science fiction fantasy authors to sit down and discuss, critique, bounce ideas off each other, and be a fly on the wall in that presentation or that gathering of minds, who would I want to be on that group? And that is what I'm going to talk about today. So I think I misspoke a little bit just a second ago when I said that I would want this to be a collection of my favorite authors. And I don't think that's entirely true, because some of my favorite authors, at least through the interviews that I have read about them or what I know about them through reading, some of them are homebodies. Some of them don't like to be in large crowds. Some of them, the very idea of sitting down with a large group of people and discussing their work would be something that was not at all desirable to them. So rather, I have picked a group of 10 science fiction and fantasy authors whose work I definitely admire, whose work in also the realm of literary critique I find fascinating, whose book recommendations I often take, and whose ability to engage in public speaking or in that sort of literary critique I find enjoyable. Some of these authors, I love their books. Some of them I enjoyed their books, and some of them, or at least one of them, I haven't read any of their books, but I think that they're a fascinating fantasy author, and I would love to have them involved in this grouping. So as I said, I stuck to 10 people because I don't want this video to be a million years long, and I thought it would just be a fun way to discuss some things about some of our favorite or some well-known fantasy authors that we don't get the chance to talk about in book reviews. So the first author, or I guess two authors that I put on my list, I kind of put in as a package deal, and that would be J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. So they have a bit of an advantage having been in their own group similar to this with the Inklings. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were quite good friends throughout a great portion of their lives. They provided feedback on each other's work. They were staunch advocates for each other's work. And even if maybe they didn't always agree with the other's literary style, they definitely did promote each other's work during the time of which it was published. Now, it's always hard to know exactly what happens with friends as we're looking back through the lens of history and through reporting and through sensationalist media that wants to always get a story. But it does seem like they had a bit of a falling out later in life. And perhaps getting back together for this literary roundtable would be something to mend that bridge. But I definitely think that if I were going to choose one of them, which I absolutely wanted to choose J.R.R. Tolkien, as The Lord of the Rings is one of my favorite series of all time, as I think that he had one of the greatest fantasy minds in the history of the genre, as he was a lecturer at Oxford whose lectures I read online were something like a tavern hall. People got really excited. They got really into them. I think that he would just be a great presence and a great personality to have at a gathering of the minds like this. And in my mind, at least, or the romantic part of my mind that cares about a good friendship, about overcoming any troubles that they may have had, would love to see C.S. Lewis there at Tolkien's side. I also really enjoy Narnia. I love the nostalgia factor. I have been reading those books with my own kids, and there's just something magical and something very accessible about the way that his books are written. So I think that he would also have a lot to contribute to this sort of setup. The next person that I would place at this literary roundtable would, of course, be Stephen King. And I said this wasn't going to be a list of my favorite authors, but although King is my favorite author, I also feel like he would be perfect for this kind of setup. Not only do I really enjoy his writing, based on the nonfiction that I have read by him and the interviews that I have seen him give, he also has this self-deprecating kind of humor that works really good in terms of self-reflection and critique. He's very open and honest about his strengths and his weaknesses. He is an advocate for writers at all levels of their careers, and he's not afraid to give an opinion about books that he enjoys. I've seen him champion books that are totally outside his regular genre. I've seen him stand up for what he believes in all spheres of his life. I really enjoy following him on Twitter. I think he's really funny, really relatable, and he just seems like a good guy to have a chat with. He seems like he is the kind of person who would excel in this type of environment, who would really gain a lot by sitting down and chatting with other authors. And for me, he is an absolute must to have at my own personal Algonquin roundtable. In a similar vein, I would absolutely 100% have to put Neil Gaiman at this table. Neil Gaiman is one of the most versatile writers. I think he is the most versatile writer of science fiction fantasy that I have read. Whether he is writing adult sci-fi or adult fantasy, whether he's writing urban fantasy, middle grade fantasy, poetry, short stories, graphic novels, whatever he does is always fantastic. There's very little of his work that I have picked up and thought like, this is unreadable. I don't think I've ever thought that. Some I like more than others. I am a personal huge fan of his short stories. I think they showcase his imagination spectacularly. But I just think that he is an excellent writer in general. He is very well read, and he is appreciative of the authors who have come before him. He gives so much credit to his early influences, and he talks about them at great length. He is a phenomenal public speaker, whether it's his commencement addresses, whether it's his interviews, his own audiobook narration. He has a presence in terms of his speaking that is so easy to get lost in. I love listening to his books via audio, and I love watching him in interviews. He also does on his blog. I feel like he's very good at kind of the stirring speech. His New Year's Eve blog posts are always really enjoyable, and I think that he has a talent in saying kind of profound and impactful things without venturing into cliche or making them seem maudlin, which is definitely a talent. He seems like he would be a great critique partner and someone who I would love to sit down and listen to talk about science fiction and fantasy for hours and hours. Shifting into the Canadian world, another one of my favorite authors and someone whom I believe is an excellent public speaker and critique partner is Margaret Atwood. So Margaret Atwood is a Canadian author of literary fiction and also literary science fiction, and she has also written a work of nonfiction about science fiction and fantasy and kind of engaging in literary criticism in that way. I really adore her works. I think thematically there's a lot to explore there. One of her, I think it's a novel from the early 2000s, Oryx and Crake, is one of my favorite works of science fiction of all time. And I had the pleasure of seeing Margaret Atwood speak at a writers' festival. I think it was 6 summers ago. But she is so witty. She is a delight to listen to. She made the funniest and like kind of dirtiest jokes at this writers festival, and I had such a good time listening to her. I had always admired her work. I originally studied it in university, and then when I enjoyed the first book I had read by her, which was The Handmaid's Tale, when I enjoyed that so much, I went on to read other pieces of her work and really enjoyed them as well. I think she would make a fantastic addition to a group of writers like this, and she's got some very strong opinions, and she also is not afraid to talk about them. She is, again, another author who comes off as very self-deprecating, but can appreciate her own strengths, and I think that she would make a lovely addition to this group of authors. The next author that I have placed on this list, I originally read work of his that was not in the science fiction and fantasy realm, and that is Ta-Nehisi Coates. So I had originally read his work of nonfiction, Between the World and Me, and was completely blown away by his writing style. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote as a journalist, I think it might have been a political correspondent for The Atlantic. His work has been very highly praised. He was awarded the MacArthur Genius Grant, which is essentially this grant for kind of the brightest of the bright to be able to write what they are interested in writing, pursue what they're interested in pursuing. And he has ventured into the science fiction and fantasy sphere. He has written for Marvel on their Black Panther run very successfully. And he also has a novel, which I haven't read, but I am really interested in checking out, that has fantastical elements. What I enjoyed reading about, or what I enjoyed from Ta-Nehisi Coates' writing when I experienced it, was that he did not back down from his beliefs and his opinions. He has a very strong sense of self, or seems to have a very strong sense of self from his writing. And after reading his nonfiction, I did go, and I do this often, I did go and watch a bunch of interviews, and he's also not afraid to kind of push in interviews, to push back at the person he's speaking with and force them to reflect, to force them to think outside their views, think outside their box. And I think that that would make for some really amazing conversation. I think that he is a very strong presence, just emotionally, physically, and I think that he would be fantastic to sit down and talk to. I know through reading old interviews with him that he was a huge science fiction and fantasy geek as a young boy, played Dungeons and Dragons, and so despite the fact that I think the majority of his career has been taken up with political writings, I think he also has that spark of nerdiness that would make him fantastic for a setting like this. Number 7 on this list of 10 would be Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. So I love Frankenstein, but I also, and perhaps even more so, adore Mary Shelley as a historical literary figure. Mary Shelley had a very fascinating and very sad, actually, a very sad life, mired in a lot of personal tragedy, a lot of pain that you can see within her writing, without a doubt. She was a very young girl when she originally started to craft Frankenstein, and it's hard to know, again, when you look back, like how much of this is a legend that we have built up around a person and how much is the truth of what actually happened. But kind of the popular origin story for Frankenstein is that Mary Shelley had been visiting Switzerland with her romantic partner and Lord Byron, and they had kind of been sitting around a fire and were challenging each other to tell ghost stories. And the ghost story that Mary Shelley came up with was the seed from which Frankenstein eventually grew and became a full novel. And that is just a fantastic origin story, especially for a book like Frankenstein. And I think personally it makes Mary Shelley the perfect person to put in this group of literary figures. She is clearly someone who would thrive off of the attention and critique of her fellow authors. She had such radical views for a lady during the time in which she was born. She had radical views about politics, about feminism. She was such a brilliant mind, and she helped to grow an entire genre of literature. Her story is so beloved, has been adapted so many times, and I think that she would be an absolutely fascinating person to spend time with, to learn from, and to listen to. The penultimate pick for my Algonquin Roundtable is another Canadian author and someone who is new to me, and that is Fonda Lee, who is the author of the Green Bone Saga. These books, Jade City and Jade War, were super popular on BookTube last year, and I have read both of them. Do not have the same love for them that many booktubers do, but there were a couple of elements of them that I found really interesting and made me more interested in Fonda Lee as a person and as a writer. I happen to think that the combat was excellent, and I wanted to know, was there some reason for that? Did Fonda Lee have some insight or some experience with combat? And I also thought that the political machinations were really well done. They seemed very realistic. She tackled politics and the trickle-down effect and so many things in such a smart and compelling way that I felt like she must lead a very interesting life. And she does. She is a black belt, and so that is where a lot of the experience writing combat comes from, I presume. You can obviously be a very talented martial artist and not be a good writer, but fortunately Fonda Lee is both, and so she can translate one of those interests very well to paper. And she is also a former corporate strategist, which I feel like I have a vague idea what that means just based on what the name implies, but this is a career path that I have thought nothing of. It is not something that I've often sat and thought like, oh, I wonder what those people do. But it seems like such a cool life experience to have, something that is so interesting to bring into your work, and something that you can definitely see reflected in her writing. I think that Fonda Lee is a super fun person to follow on Twitter. I have really enjoyed her dismay at the prolonged wait for the next series or the end of this present season of Attack on Titan. So I think that she would also just be a fun person to spend time with and definitely would make a great addition to this group. My final pick is the one author whose works I actually haven't experienced, and I've been thinking about this video for a long time, and that 10th person has kind of bounced in and out. I have thought of a variety of people, but recently I mentioned on the channel that I was going to do a video about Michael Moorcock. So Michael Moorcock is a very influential British fantasy writer, really well known for his Elric series, and as I now know from reading more about him, a staunch literary critic and critic of science fiction and fantasy. When I was doing some research about him, had found that he wrote an essay called Epic Pooh that kind of critiques the modern, or I guess modern in his time, that kind of like 1950s to 70s romantic style fantasy and whether or not that has much literary merit. He has co-authored a list and exploration of the 100 best fantasy books of all time, which I do have recorded in one of my notebooks and would love to check out more works from that. And he seems like someone who is very willing to stand up and tell people what he believes is good fantasy, isn't good fantasy. And I think that he would be the perfect foil, the perfect disturbing presence, we'll say, to throw into the middle of all these science fiction and fantasy authors and be really vocal about his strong opinions, which I really enjoy. As a fly on the wall, I would really enjoy that. I would have a lot of fun watching him, educate people about what is the best fantasy to read and what isn't. And obviously this isn't good fun. I don't know him. I don't think he would be a mean person, or I assume that most people are not mean people. I mean this in the most, in the funnest sense of the word. I think that it would be fun to stir the pot a little bit and have someone who has some really strong opinions and who has worked as a literary critic and who can bring that type of reflection into the group. I think that that would make it quite fun to watch and listen to. So this is something that obviously I have thought about a lot. I often think about spending time with my favorite authors, maybe not even having to speak myself, but just being able to kind of look down so that I don't have to worry about my own anxiety or asking silly questions, but just being able to be in a room with these fantastic fantasy minds, these people of different backgrounds and interests and life experiences. If I had the opportunity to select any fantasy authors from those who are living or who have passed, these are the 10 that I would select. These are the people who I would love to hear from and see bounce ideas off each other. And I had a lot of fun discussing this. If there's anybody who's watching who also has a channel, I would love to hear or see you speak about something similar. I think as nerdy fantasy lovers, we often think about these types of situations, and I would love to know which authors spark your interest, not only for their work, but for who they seem to be as people, their interests, the things that make them the compelling and interesting authors that they are. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I will see you with another one soon. Bye.